Good evening, sinners and saints. It is I, your friendly neighborhood sin hound, welcoming you to Rent-A-Friend Radio yet again. We have got, well, today we're not going to talk about the science of evolution as much as the application. And I know you're saying to yourself, application? How does one apply a theory such as evolution? Well, hold on to your hats, my little friends, because it's about to get ugly! I have, of course, the Creation Evolution Chocolate Bars and Worms slideshow. Today, we are going to delve into the way that this theory is and has been, and I feel like has to be applied to the human race, because they have not left us out of this theory. Oh, some people have tried. They have tried, my friends, but they have failed. So, here is why all of this matters. Because all the time people be saying to me, sit down, what is the point? Why are we having this debate? Why? Who cares? I had to do it on Facebook last week. Just left that comment. Like, who cares? Why does this matter? I'm about to explain to you why it matters. Because we, as citizens of this planet, are not immune from the Darwinian model. And so, here's how it affects us. Starting with this. What does Darwin teach about humans? Well, you've probably seen this slide, or this image in your textbooks. I think it started off, originally published for Time magazine back in the 50s or 60s or something. And you recognize this as the March of Time or the March of Progress, that kind of thing. It has been lampooned and parodied in a lot of ways by everybody in the world. But this is a picture depicting what we are told is the evolutionary history of human beings. Where did we come from? There it is, in beautiful black and white, or black and yellow, I guess. So, what does Darwinism teach us about humans? What is a human being? What does it even mean to be human? These are the questions that evolution attempts to answer, because it is a religion with its own dogma. As we talked about a long time ago, it is meant to be a full-fledged replacement for Christianity. And so, it has an origin story for the human race. The out-of-Africa theory is the predominant theory, and it has been pretty much since Darwin wrote about it back in the late 1800s. And this model is still taught. When I was in college, we watched a National Geographic video called, I think, The Journey of Man, which basically made this argument, and it attempted to link it to mitochondrial DNA. The theory is very simple. In Africa, there were apes. Apes evolved in Africa, so that's why it's out of Africa. Because those apes became walking apes. And one of those lines of walking apes became the first human beings. And some of them spread throughout the world, all over the place. And this is one of many different pictures you can get representing about when they showed up. And maybe what kind of humanoid creature it was. But essentially, the human race starts in Africa and then spreads out. And of course, continues evolving to different kinds of people. Now, here's the question, though. Here is the issue. I'm going to do a little uncharacteristically, and I'm going to stop the music because I want you to focus on the topic here. I want you to think about the questions I'm asking and think about the information that evolution is intending to teach you. So this is the out-of-Africa theory that the apes evolved into ape-like humanish ancestors. That over time our ape-like ancestors and our fully human ancestors might have interbred, we don't know, might have created multiple different kinds of human, and then they spread out and continued to evolve over time. That is the theory over the past 200,000 years, depending on who you ask. But This model, this out-of-Africa theory, is based on Darwinian evolution and the writings of Charles Darwin and many people who followed. The out-of-Africa theory is intending to portray this, that we started off as some kind of African monkey that became an African ape, that became some kind of African ape-man hominid, walking ape, that eventually became fully human, and that's where the human race started. But here's the question. Where does human start on this chart? Where is modern, fully evolved human? I mean, when you say human, what does that mean here? What does that mean on this model? What does it mean according to the out of Africa theory? If you were raised like me, you just looked at this chart and you assumed, because that's kind of the implication even though it's not said, that the fully evolved modern human is this person at the very front, that every human being that's alive on the planet today is this guy at the front of the list. And this guy with the stick right behind him, that's cavemen. They're sort of still kind of apish. They show up on cartoons where they're wearing something, the Fred Flintstone outfit where they have the animal skin that's not very well crafted, and they talk in sort of ooga booga booga kind of sounds. And then behind him is something even less evolved, something a little more ape-like. And if you've seen The Croods, you've got good examples of all these creatures. Cute movie. I'd give props to The Croods for being a fun movie. A good Nicolas Cage piece. Wonderfully animated, beautifully designed, fun to watch, moving. But it's built on this concept of this sort of evolution of humans. So that's what I assumed as a school child looking at this, that all of us on Earth today are this guy at the very, very front. But that's not what the chart teaches. That's not what evolution teaches. It's not what Darwin thought. It is not what the out of Africa theory teaches. Here's why it matters to have this debate. Here's why it matters that evolution is wrong and we need to oppose it. Because what does this theory teach? It teaches that this guy at the front of the line is white Europeans. Civilized white European man. That's what Darwin said. That's what he wrote. That's what his proponents have said. That's what this theory teaches, is that this guy, the white European, is the guy at the very front. Now, where the Jews show up depend on who you ask. According to Darwin, they'd be a couple of steps back. That, the Europeans, the Aryan Europeans were the most evolved, and then below them are other Europeans. Below them are the Middle Easterners, and the Jews were somewhere in there. And you go far enough back, you get to Africans, which are just before the African apes. Because on this theory, the African ape evolved into the African man, and then they spread out and evolved more, and spread out and evolved more. How is it you have things evolving along different lines and somehow all remaining equal and the same? It doesn't fit the model. Now, Hitler decided that, for political reasons, he wanted to scoot the Jews to the back of the line. Why? Because he wanted to kill them first. That's pretty much it. That's what happens when politics mixes with science. The Jews get killed first. I'm not saying in every case, but in this particular instance, that's what he did, is he took this evolutionary sequence and said, well, we want to kill the Jews first, let's move to the back. So whereas Darwin would have described the Jews as being partially ape, Hitler described them as being almost entirely ape, whereas most Western non-Nazi atheist and evolutionists would describe the Africans as being mostly ape or almost entirely ape. And that's one of the ways they describe them in the scientific literature and museums and other things which I am about to show you. So that's what this chart represents. But how did Darwin start all of this? With this book. On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Where did the word race come from? Why do we even have that? If you're in the United States or anywhere in basic Western culture, when you hear race and you hear it applied to the human race or different races of people, you tend to think of ethnicities or cultures or nationalities. It's this sort of hazy, ambiguous thing that separates black people from white people, or occasionally we talk about Hispanics or Asians, but it really depends on what politician and what they're trying to get voted into. But the word race, where does it come from? What does it mean? Well, it comes from this. It means species. It doesn't mean ethnicity or culture. It means species. That's where the word race comes from. That's how Darwin used it, and that's how it was applied to the human race. So, if this is the chart of the human race, well, who gets to decide what fully human is? This chart, and Darwin himself, and a lot of people who followed, not just Hitler, lots of people, put the white civilized European at the front, and it's basically a gradient of gradually darker and darker people up until you get to the African apes. Now, none of these creatures should be walking on two legs. They're all four-legged quadrupeds, but for the sake of the illustration, they put them on two legs to make them look a little more human. But where does fully human actually start on this chart? Or does it? Is it even a real thing? It depends who you ask. In Darwinian evolution, there's not really a clear distinction there, But according to Darwin himself and a lot of his proponents, a lot of his disciples that followed, fully human is the civilized white man. And nobody else. Everybody else is still on their way to evolving. That's what the model teaches. Now, I know you're asking yourself, well, who in the evolutionary community is talking about different species of human? Nobody does that except right-wing, racist, white supremacist extremists, right? No. These are news stories just from earlier this year. Note, they are not saying new species of human ancestor discovered. All of these articles say new species of human identified. New species of human. New species of human. That is how the scientific literature and the popular magazines referring to the scientific literature are still, and in fact increasingly in recent years, using this terminology. They're not even referring to these partially ape-like upwalking hominids. They're not referring to them as species of ape-like ancestors. They are just calling them new species of human. Okay, well, how many species of human are there? And who gets to decide where they show up on the chart? Now, just so you know this isn't a Western problem, here's the country of India, and that little red dot down there is an island called North Sentinel Island. And here is an article from an Indian blog from the Ed Times, ranked as one of the top 10 youth blogs worldwide, awarded Best Blog at India Digital Summit Awards, blah, blah, blah. So this is from the country of India. It's where Indian millennials comment on news stories around them. Here is something that they've said about the people inhabiting this island. They said they are evolving into Homo Sapiens, which is our species. The lush green swathe of 23 square miles North Sentinel Island, lying west of Labyrinth Islands in South Amsterdam, is home to one of the remaining Stone Age tribes who, till date, maintain their isolation. Believed to be direct descendants of apes becoming man. So these people, they are not saying that these people are fully human. We're saying that these people who live on this island are believed to be direct descendants of apes becoming man. So not the apes that are still in Africa now, but some of the ones that were becoming man. There have been assumptions trailing the fact that the Sentinelese, or however you pronounce that, who remained isolated for 60,000 years, are direct descendants of their pre-Neolithic ancestors. Scientific study of their DNA samples by anthropologists suggests that the Sentinelese were part of an early wave of hominids, primates, evolving into Homo sapiens, who emigrated from Africa to the far-reaching Asia and other parts of the world. So, where do they show up on this chart? They show up somewhere between Africans and African apes. That according to millennials in India, writing one of the top-ranked blogs in the world, the people living on this island near India are somewhere more evolved than today's African apes, but certainly less evolved than African people. That's what they think. That's what they have written. That's what they've blogged. And why? Because that's what evolution has taught them. What did Darwin think? According to Darwin's own writings, let me get myself out of the way here. Darwin himself believed that the evolutionary distance between the African man and the orangutan is the same as the evolutionary distance between the African man and the white European man. This is what Darwin thought, this is what he wrote, this is what he taught, and this is what many of his disciples have followed ever since. So again, people will complain about this and be like, "Oh, he wasn't a racist, he was opposed to slavery." And Nietzsche thought it was offensive to beat your horse, but Nietzsche didn't think that the horse was his equal. He just thought it was cruel to beat it and give it physical violence without justice. Darwin might have been opposed to slavery, but he absolutely did think that the white civilized European was more evolved to this extent. Let me show you that from his own words. Darwin says, in The Descent of Man, which is his book on the evolutionary history of the human race, another terrible book by Darwin, the Western nations of Europe now so immeasurably surpass their former savage progenitors, that's our evolutionary ancestors, that they stand at the summit of civilization. The civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races through the world. A bigger context of that. At some future period, not very distant as from measured by centuries, the civilized races of man, by which he's very clearly said are the white European, races, the white European species of human, will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. And in other of his writings, he describes the savage races as the Africans, as the South Americans, that he refers to them as being so animal-like that it's hard to believe that we're related. He continues, "The break between man and his nearest allies will then be wider, for it will intervene between a man in a more civilized state, as we may hope, than the Caucasian, and some apes as low as baboon, instead of, as now, between the Negro, or Australian," so he's talking here, by Negro he means African, and by Australian he's talking about the Aborigines, "and the gorilla." So here is the evolutionary distance that he is putting us in, is that right now, as he views the world, so in the mid-1800s, he is seeing that the evolutionary distance between the most evolved and the least evolved human is between us, the white civilized Europeans, and the black Africans. That there is an enormous evolutionary distance, and he equates that to being the same as, and of course he throws in the Aborigines, because why not? Because they're just as dark, they must be as unevolved. And he puts them at the end of the human spectrum and says that the distance there is the same as between the Negro or Australian and the gorilla. So there's the evolutionary distances that he puts in this chart. So when Darwin looks at this, this is what he's saying, is that you've got some kind of African ape, and then you've got the African man and the Aboriginal man, which again, National Geographic in the Journey of Man, or whatever that DVD was called I watched in college, echoed this, that these are the least evolved, closest to the ape ancestors, and then somewhere farther up the line you get less brown people like the Middle Easterners and the American Indians. And then the most evolved, showing up the last after the most evolutionary time, is the white Europeans. National Geographic is still teaching the stuff that Darwin taught. So that's Darwin and evolution. Now, how did that show up in America? Well, it's easy to jump straight to the 1930s and be like, oh, and then Hitler. But first, the 1904 World's Fair. It's funny, I could have sworn it was the 1905 World's Fair. Whatever, it's the World's Fair. I'm gonna get me out of the way here so you can see here. So this is a bit of how this evolutionary theory showed up in America. So again, it reared its ugly head all over Western culture in Europe and in Australia, but here's how it showed up in America. So the 1904 World Fair, we had the human zoo. Now, this is from humanzoos.net. Human zoo is a term for a phenomenon of the late 19th and 20th century where exotic human beings, meaning non-Europeans, from all over the world were publicly exhibited in cities of the industrialized world, sometimes even its colonies. The main attraction of human zoos was the promise to show the authentic traditional life of peoples far away. And they go on to say that this kind of thing has been done all through human history, that people who are affluent get to bring in the poor indigenous peoples of wherever to look at them as an art piece or whatever, that it's not necessarily in any way linked to evolution or to dehumanizing racism or anything like that. It's like, why does a Chinese restaurant have the decorations that it has? It's because if we want to see our own living room, we stay home and we cook something in the microwave. We go to a Chinese restaurant to get food that is not our normal, at least that was the theory back when it started. And they decorate the place to look like something that we would consider to be Chinese. Kind of like The Mikado was a play that, sort of used Japanese art to create its depiction of what was essentially a satire on British culture. Anyway, so that's that whole thing. So I'm not going to try to paint everybody involved with this as being as evil as possible, but the 1904 World's Fair, their human zoo was marketed and publicized as being a display of the evolution of humankind, meaning the evolution of us, the white civilized Europeans, from our evolutionary ancestors. That brought in one named character. Now, there's many people whose names we know, but here's one whose story thankfully got told, so we can tell it now. In the early 1900s, evolutionists justified keeping Ota Benga at the zoo. So, because of evolutionary theory, it was accepted by evolutionists then, as it is by some now. Most of them don't know it. I'm not going to pretend that all evolutionists, or even the majority, know this part of evolutionary theory. This is one of those dirty little secrets that the textbooks tend to leave out. They'll teach the out of Africa theory, but then they they stop shy of actually explaining what it means. Well, back in the day, everybody knew what it meant, and some of them were darn proud of it. So Ota Benga was brought in as part of the human zoo, and after that, he wound up in the New York Zoo. So after being at the World's Fair as part of the human zoo, he was put in the actual literal zoo in the monkey cage. So following is an article from the New York Times from 1906. The exhibition was that of a human being in a monkey cage. The human being happened to be a bushman, one of a race that scientists do not rate high on the human scale. Note the reference to evolution. It is possibly a good thing that Benga doesn't think very deeply. If he did, it isn't likely he was very proud of himself when he woke in the morning and found himself under the same roof with orangutans and monkeys, for that is where he really is. Note also the assumption that because he is low on the human scale, that he can't think very deeply. He's not capable of introspection, but this is not an isolated. The New York Times was great for this incident because they, like today, spoke their mind. Ota Benga is a normal specimen of his race or tribe with a brain as much developed as are those of other members. The pygmies are very low on the human scale, and the suggestion that Benga should be in school instead of in a cage ignores the high probability that school would be a place of torture to him, and one from which he could draw no advantage whatsoever. The idea that men are all much alike except as they have had or lacked opportunities for getting an education out of books is now far out of date. With training carefully adapted in his mental limitations, this pygmy could doubtless be taught many things, but there is no chance that he could learn anything in an ordinary school. Because of evolutionary dogma, how are we viewing this African man? And while he looked young, Ota Benga here is actually at least in his mid-20s. That he looks young for his age. His whole tribe does. That's one of the things about pygmies is they're short and they look young. So he looked younger than he was, but by the time he was in the zoo in New York, he had been married twice and had children in Africa before he was brought over to the United States. And the New York Times is saying, well, because we know that these Africans are low on the evolutionary scale, school would be useless, books would be useless. He's incapable of that kind of thinking. So, some of this I get from creation.com. I got the link there. Although it was widely believed at this time, even by eminent scientists, that blacks were evolutionarily inferior to Caucasians, caging one in a zoo produced much publicity and controversy, especially from ministers and African Americans. Several black ministers were determined to stop the exhibit. In Reverend Gordon's words, our race, so this is a black reverend, our race is depressed enough without exhibiting one of us with the apes. We think we are worthy of being considered human beings with souls. Furthermore, many of the ministers opposed the theory of evolution, concluding that the exhibition evidently aims to be a demonstration of the Darwinian theory of evolution. The Darwinian theory is absolutely opposed to Christianity, and a public demonstration in its favor should not be permitted. Oh, you got to admit that's true. And as modern evolutionists of today have said, it is in contrast with Christianity, and in fact, it is intended to be a replacement for it. But the New York Times did not fail. They replied to the black pastors objecting to this display of evolution by sticking an African man in the ape cage. One Times article responded to the criticism that the display lent credibility to Darwinism with the following words. One reverend colored brother objects to the curious exhibition on the grounds that it is an impious effort to lend credibility to Darwin's dreadful theories. The reverend colored brother should be told that evolution is now taught in the textbooks of all the schools, and that it is no more debatable than the multiplication table. Bum, bum, bum. So the same attitude more than a full century ago. And again, without the fossil evidence to back it up, with nothing more than the basic rejection of biblical Christianity. This kind of arrogance was already part of evolutionary theory. It is no more debatable than the evolutionary table. Really? Based on what? Well, based on if you start with atheism, what do you got? Who was it that was opposing this? It was Christians who said, humans are all human. You should not be sticking one in the zoo to go on display. The full story of Ota Benga is one that is worth learning. I recommend you look into it, but I'm going to continue along the lines of European history in terms of evolutionary dogma. Ask yourself, why? Why was there the Nazi Holocaust? What was Hitler trying to do? Once you understand it as part of evolutionary dogma, it makes sense. I'm not saying it's right. Clearly, it is evil evil, evil pure and through. But if you have convinced yourself, first of all, that we live in a godless universe where there is no right and wrong, where there is might, and that makes right, where there is natural selection due to nature red in tooth and claw, well, what do you do with the human race? Well, if the human race is a series of differently evolved species, then do you want the most evolved, fully human species breeding with animals? And it doesn't matter how animal. Are they half ape? Are they a third ape? It doesn't matter. What Hitler decided is to take a militaristic approach to Darwinian dogma and say the most evolved species should not be interbreeding with the inferior species because that does not drive evolution forward. It makes us inferior. It takes us back into our evolutionary past. And so to keep the most evolved species of human from interbreeding with others, he first deemed them as poison, he taught hatred against them, and then started slaughtering them. And here's something that a lot of people tend to forget. Hitler and the Nazis were not just anti-Semites. They weren't just Jew haters. They were intending to separate the Aryan human species from all the other human species, and then to slaughter every single one of the other species so that none existed. They were not going to stop when all the Jews were dead. They were then going to kill every other human being on the planet who was not Aryan and a Nazi. Because that's what happens when you take an atheistic Darwin evolution and you apply it to the military and you look to the future. You treat the human race like animal husbandry. You have the show dogs, the most evolved, the best breed of show dog. Do you let it mate with some kind of wild animal? Some kind of common mutt? No, you throw those in the pound and then you exterminate them. Or you put them to sleep. But this kind of evolutionary dogma, this idea that we should be exterminating the lesser species of human because they're not fully human, came to the United States in the form of Margaret Sanger. She said lots of great things, not enough that we have recorded because her legacy has been just whitewashed and bleached mercilessly by liberals who don't want the truth to be told. But she said a couple of things we still have record of. For instance, she said this: "It is said the Aboriginal Australian, the lowest known species of the human family, is just a step higher than the chimpanzee in brain development." So, again, she disagreed a little about who was the lowest form of human being, which is the lowest species. But she said very clearly, these dark-skinned people of the wild, they're barely better than chimpanzees. And so when she saw Ota Benga in the zoo, would have made perfect sense to her. That to her, in her evolutionary worldview, that's what should have happened. Sanger supported sterilization for the incarcerated and considered birth control a necessary component of racial improvement. Again, this is in the United States. Margaret Sanger founded Planned Parenthood to clean the human race of what she considered to be essentially a poison. It's the same thing that Hitler was doing by killing off the Jews. But I feel like he learned from her because she came first. To deal with the problem of resistance among the black population, Sanger recruited black doctors and nurses and ministers and social workers in order to gain black patients, to gain their trust, in order to limit or even erase the black presence in America. Again, Margaret Sanger was not trying to give freedoms and rights to women. She is not the champion of the feminist narrative that you're hearing today. Margaret Sanger was a white supremacist looking to exterminate those that she felt were the less fit, less evolved, subhuman species. She was trying to kill off all of Black America. That's why she started and began so hard. And even today, more Planned Parenthoods are found in black neighborhoods. And for this reason, because that's where it started. Because the goal, as it was founded, was to exterminate Black America. Sanger's movement had an impact in many nations. Her programs involving sterilization of the unfit were adopted by Sweden, Norway, Finland, Denmark, and most infamously by Nazi Germany. The Nazis looked to the founder of Planned Parenthood and learned from her how to start their own Holocaust. The unfortunate difference is that while we ended the Holocaust in Germany, hers is still going on. We're still slaughtering babies. And one of the arguments that's used in defense of it is like, well, we go through an evolutionary path as we're developing in the womb. That at one point we go through a worm stage and then a fish stage where you can find textbooks, modern American textbooks, that still, because of information that was outdated a century ago, will tell you that as a baby develops in the womb, it has gill slits, that we are basically a fish in your mother's womb. And so an abortion is just killing off a fish. It's a pile of lies based on this crap because of psychopaths like this, all based on the evolutionary dogma. But what does science say? Because so far, nothing I've said proves evolution is false. It just proves that it is very evil and has been applied to do great evil by evil people. But what does science say about it? There's no scientific basis for race. It's a made-up label. This is National Geographic. National Geographic still believes and teaches the out of Africa theory. And yet, when we look at what does genetics tell us, there are no human races. There is a human race. There's one species of human. Genetic studies have shown us, and have shown us for the better part of a couple of decades, that any two members of a group, so any two Africans, or any two Europeans, or any two Asians, or whatever, will be more genetically different than those groups are different from each other. In other words, Africans as a whole, and Europeans as a whole, are more genetically similar to each other than any two Africans are genetically similar to each other, or any two Europeans are genetically similar to each other. So the big picture here is that people are people. Genetically, there is not human races. There is but a single human race, one species, one kind, all descended from one first parents, Adam and Eve. It doesn't fit the evolutionary model. Genetics does not fit. And those true believers, I got a message today on Facebook trying to link this somehow. And I was told that, that idea was disproven by evolutionary biology. Like, no, that idea was disproven by genetics, observable biology, not evolutionary biology. Evolutionary biology tells us that there's different species of human, and evolutionists still talk that way, as I showed. What modern genetics, observable science has shown us is that science cannot defend evolution. It disproves it. That there is one species of human. Also, aside from genetics proving evolution wrong, the fossil evidence also fails Darwin, because in the fossils, despite the fact that people have been trying for more than a century to find that missing link, it's still missing. No ape man has ever existed. The chart here is all fraud and propaganda. All those circled in blue there, none of those should be walking. None of those are bipeds. They're all quadrupeds. And the illustrator of this chart admitted that he drew them walking on two legs, not because that's what they do, but because it works for the chart. It sort of reinforces this idea that they are walking toward humanhood, even though it's not accurate. A bunch of the species in the middle in orange there, some of those just don't exist. There was the one at the Scopes trial, William Jennings Bryan, the Inherit the Wind. If you watch that movie, it's a pile of lies. But one of the things that was presented as evidence of evolution being a fact was the Nebraska man. That we have this proof of this ape man hominid, this ancestor of the human race, and that was presented on trial as evidence of evolution. And the Nebraska man was later discovered to be an extinct pig. And how did we determine this? Because the entire fossil evidence for Nebraska man was a single tooth, which was interpreted, according to evolutionary lines, to be ape man, but later discovered to be extinct pig. Yeah, and there's like a dozen or more versions of that. The proposed ape man ancestor turns out to be entirely fraud. Over and over and over, they are fraud. Which means in the red circle there, we have humans. Not different races of human, but different ethnicities, different genetic lineages where some have dark hair, some have light hair, some do well in the sun, some don't, but they're all human. They are genetically a single species, one kind, all descended from Adam and Eve. There is one race, the human race. Okay, there's animals and there's humans. God, who made the world and everything in it, is the Lord of heaven and earth and does not live in temples built by human hands. He is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. From one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so they could seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. All human beings are cousins from the same great-grandparents. We are all one species. There is one human race. So in summary, As I have been trying these past episodes to explain the difference between biblical creation and evolution, Genesis teaches a 6-day creation about 6,000 years ago and a global flood. Observational science confirms these claims. Old Earth creation and evolution teach us slow, gradual changes and increase in genetic information, structure, and function of all living things, resulting in all life on Earth. The origin of life in DNA remains a mystery, but we have faith that someday science will discover it. Maybe even Bill Nye. Observational science shows the evolutionary claims to be impossible. Evolution is countered by changing the definition to match what is observable, but what's not Darwinian. Fossils show the flood, not evolution. Evolution leads to godlessness and death. Creation shows the brotherhood of mankind, one human race, one family, made in the image of God. Science shows the Bible can be trusted, and Jesus loves you. Why does all this matter? Again, like I began, let me go out here. The reason why all of this matters, the reason why it's worth it to have this debate is because we are showing that the Bible can be trusted, that science and Scripture are of one voice. And the point, the central core of the entire Bible is summed up in John 3:16, "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but will have eternal life." That is why this discussion is worth having. That is why it's worth debating. That's why I make these videos. That's why I'm here for you on Rent-A-Friend Radio. But I am not here any longer today. It's time to call it a day. Your Sin Hound will be back on Rent-A-Friend Radio in the not-too-distant future. Send me questions and comments. In the meantime, I want you, my sinners and saints, to continue to tell the stories that bring life. Be excellent to each other. And party on, dudes.